The lights on the Velith command station flickered in warning patterns that nobody wanted to see. High Counselor Methara stood before the massive viewing screen with her 4 arms crossed tight against her chest and her silver eyes wide with fear. The short distress signal had come through 17 minutes ago, and it was still playing on repeat. "This is Ambassador Kethril of the diplomatic vessel Starweaver," the recording said in a voice filled with terror. "We are under attack in the Kethar system by Shorn Collective. Warships and our engines are destroyed, and our shields are failing, and we have wounded crew members who need help. And please, if anyone can hear this, we are going to die out here." The message cut off with the sound of an explosion, and then static. Methara turned to face the other members of the High Council, and she could see the same helpless expression on all of their faces. "How long until our nearest fleet can reach them?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer. Admiral Vashkin checked his display screen, and his tentacles curled with frustration. 14 hours at maximum speed," he said quietly. "The Kethar system is too far from any of our patrol routes. The ambassador will be dead in 14 hours. Counselor Theric said with bitterness in his voice. "The Shorn do not take prisoners from diplomatic missions, and they will make an example of her to frighten the rest of the Confederacy." The Velith Confederacy had existed for 3,000 years, and it had grown to include 6 different spacefaring species who had learned to live together in peace. But peace had made them soft, and the Shorn Collective knew it. The Shorn were conquerors and slavers who swept across the galaxy, taking whatever they wanted and crushing anyone who tried to stop them. Their warships were brutal things covered in spikes and weapons, and their soldiers were raised from birth to know nothing but violence. For decades, the Confederacy had tried to negotiate with them, and for decades, the Shorn had responded with mockery and aggression. Now they had attacked a diplomatic vessel in neutral space, and there was nothing the Confederacy could do about it. "There must be something," Methara said as she paced back and forth across the command center. "Someone closer who could respond." The room went very quiet. Everyone knew what system was closest to Kethar, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. Finally, old Counselor Drethan spoke up with his ancient voice crackling like dry leaves. "There is one option," he said, "but it is an option we have avoided for 80 years. "No," Admiral Vashkin said immediately. "Absolutely not. The Sol system is only 40 minutes away from Kethar at standard jump speed." Drethan continued as if the Admiral had not spoken. "If we broadcast the distress signal on an open channel, it will reach them. And then what?" Vashkin demanded with anger rising in his voice. "We invite the Deathworlders into our space and hope they feel like being helpful?" Methara felt a chill run through her body at the word Deathworlders. Years ago, Confederacy explorers had discovered a small blue planet orbiting a yellow star at the edge of the galaxy. They had expected to find simple life forms or perhaps primitive civilizations instead. They had found Earth. The reports from that first expedition had terrified everyone who read them. Earth was a Category 9 death world, which was the highest classification on the danger scale. The planet was covered in active volcanoes and fault lines that caused massive earthquakes. Its weather systems produced hurricanes and tornadoes and floods that could destroy entire regions. The animal life was filled with apex predators that had evolved for millions of years to become perfect killing machines. And somehow, against all logic and reason, a sapient species had evolved there. Humans had not just survived on their death world, but they had thrived. They had conquered predators that could tear them apart with ease. They had built cities that withstood earthquakes and storms. They developed technology and medicine and art, and most disturbing of all, they had looked at the Confederacy explorers with curiosity instead of fear. The galaxy had decided very quickly that humans were too dangerous to be allowed into the wider community. A quarantine was established around the Sol system, and contact was forbidden. The humans had accepted this with surprising grace, and had simply continued developing on their own. But everyone knew they were still. They're waiting. We do not know what the humans would do if they received this signal, Counselor Theric said nervously. They might ignore it, or they might use it as an excuse to break quarantine and attack us all. Or they might help. Drethan said simply. Why would they help? Voshkin asked with disbelief. We locked them away from the galaxy for 80 years, and now we expect them to rescue us. Mathara closed her eyes and thought about Ambassador Kethrilsh. Had known Kethril for 50 years, and they had trained together as young diplomats. Kethril had 3 children waiting for her back home. Send the signal. Mathara said. High Counselor, this is madness. Voshkin protested. Send it now, she repeated with steel in her voice. On an open channel so everyone can hear, including the humans. The communication officer looked at the Admiral and then at the High Counselor, and then he turned back to his console and began transmitting. Distress signal flew out into space at the speed of light, and it passed through the quarantine barrier around the Volney Sol system as if the barrier did not exist on Earth. The signal was picked up by listening stations on every continent in the headquarters of the United Earthspace. Command alarms began to sound. Admiral Chen Wei-Lin was eating her lunch when her aide burst into the room with a tablet in his shaking hands. Ma'am, you need to see this, he said. She took the tablet and listened to the distress call, and she felt something wake up inside her chest. Something that had been sleeping for a very long time. How far? She asked. 40 minutes at combat speed, her aide replied. Admiral Chun stood up and walked to the window of her office, and she looked out at the sky. For 80 years, humanity had been watching the stars and waiting. They had built ships and trained soldiers and developed weapons that the galaxy could not imagine, not because they wanted war, but because they knew that someday someone would need them. That day had finally come. Contact the Third Fleet, Admiral Chun said calmly. Tell them to spin up their drives and prepare for immediate departure, and inform the President that humanity is about to introduce itself to the galaxy. 14 minutes after the signal reached Earth, a reply was sent. Back on the same open channel. The message was short and simple, and it made every species in the Confederacy freeze with shock. Message received. The human voice said, Fleet dispatched and hold position in the Cathar system. Ambassador Kethral huddled with her surviving crew in a damaged cargo bay as shore boarding parties cut through the hull. She had accepted that she was going to die. She did not know that help was already on the way, and neither did the Shorn. Warlord Fix stood on the bridge of his flagship and smiled with all 3 rows of his razor-sharp teeth. The Velith diplomatic ship hung in space before him, broken and burning and beautiful in its destruction. This was the moment he had been waiting for, and this was the message he would send to the entire galaxy. The Confederacy was weak, and the Shorn Collective would take whatever they wanted. How many prisoners? He asked his second in command. 43 survivors, Commander Kresh replied, including the ambassador herself. Excellent, Thix said with pleasure in his voice. We will execute them one by one and broadcast it across every channel, and let the Confederacy see what happens to those who oppose us. His fleet of 30 warships surrounded the crippled Velith vessel like predators, circling wounded prey. This had been almost too easy. This Confederacy had grown soft in their 3,000 years of peace, and they had forgotten what real power looked like. Thix was about to remind them. Warlord, his sensor officer called out with a strange tone in his voice. We are detecting unusual readings at the edge of the system. What kind of readings? Thix asked without much interest. Spatial distortions, the officer said as his hands moved frantically across his console. Multiple signatures, and they are increasing. Thix turned to look at the main viewing screen, and he felt the first cold touch of confusion. Points of light were appearing in the darkness of space, and at first there were only a few, but then there were dozens, and then there were hundreds. What is happening? Commander Crash asked with worry creeping into his voice. The sensor officer did not respond because he was too busy staring at his readings with an expression of pure terror on his face. Report. Thix demanded. Warlord, the officer said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. I am detecting 47 capital ships and over 200 support vessels, and they are not Confederacy designs. The points of light became holes in space. Itself and ships began pouring through like water through a broken dam. Thix had seen warships from every major power in the galaxy, and he had destroyed many of them with his own hands. But he had never seen anything like these. The human vessels were massive and angular and covered in weapons that his computer could not even identify. Their hulls were scarred with the marks of old battles, and their surfaces were painted with symbols and words in a language he did not recognize. They moved with a coordination that should have been impossible for such a large fleet, and they arranged themselves into attack formation as smoothly as a single organism. At the center of the formation was the largest ship Thix had ever seen. It was a dreadnought class vessel that dwarfed even his flagship, and its name was painted on its hull in letters that burned with defiant pride. Uis. Perseverance. On the bridge of that ship, Admiral Chan Wei-Lin stood with her hands clasped behind her back and her eyes fixed on the Shorn fleet. She was 62 years old, and she had spent her entire adult life preparing for this moment. Every simulation and every training exercise and every sleepless night had led to this. Status report, she said calmly. All ships in position, her tactical officer replied. Weapons hot and shields at full power. The Shorn fleet? She asked. 30 warships arranged in a defensive sphere around the damaged Velith vessel, and they are charging their weapons. Admiral Chun nodded slowly, and she allowed herself a small smile. Galaxy had spent 80 years being afraid of humanity, and today they would learn why that fear was justified. But not in the way they expected. Open a channel, she ordered. All frequencies. Channel open, Admiral. She straightened her uniform, and she spoke in a voice that carried the weight of 8 billion people who had been waiting for this chance. Attention, Shorn collective vessels, she said. This is Admiral Chun Wei-Lin of the United Earth Space Command, and I am addressing the commander of your fleet. On his own bridge, Warlord Thix watched the human admiral appear on his screen, and he felt something he had not felt in decades: fear. But he was Shorn, and the Shorn did not show fear to their enemies. Human, he said, with as much contempt as he could manage. You are in violation of galactic quarantine protocols, and you will withdraw your fleet immediately or face the consequences. The human admiral did not flinch, and she did not look away, and she did not show any sign of intimidation. I am aware of the quarantine, she replied evenly, but I am also aware that you have attacked a civilian vessel and taken prisoners, and that is not something we can ignore. This is not your concern, Thix said with growing anger. The Confederacy is weak, and they deserve what happens to them, and you have no right to interfere. You are correct that we have no legal right, Admiral Chun said. But we have something more important than legal rights, and that is the ability to stop you. She paused, and her eyes seemed to look directly into his soul. We are humanity, she continued. We evolved on a world that tried to kill us every single day, and we survived, and we do not like bullies who prey on the weak. So I am giving you one chance to correct your mistake. And if I refuse? Thix asked, even though he already knew the answer. Then we will correct it for you. The channel went silent, and Thix looked at his tactical display, and he saw the human fleet beginning to move. They were spreading out to surround his position, and they were doing it with a speed and precision that made his veteran crews look like amateurs. Warlord, what are your orders? Commander Crash asked with naked fear in his voice. Thix looked at the human dreadnought, and he thought about everything he knew about Deathworlders. Reports said that humans could survive injuries that would kill any other species. The reports said that humans bonded with predator animals and brought them into battle. The reports said that humans did not know how to surrender. For the first time in his long career, Warlord Thix considered retreat, but his pride would not allow it. All ships prepare to engage. He commanded, "We will show these Deathworlders what the Shorn Collective is capable of." On the Perseverance, Admiral Chun watched the Shorn fleet power up their weapons, and she felt no fear, only sadness. They are choosing the hard way. A first officer observed, "They usually do." Chun replied, "All ships, you are weapons-free, and protect that diplomatic vessel at all costs, and show them who we are." The Third Solar Fleet surged forward, and the first battle between humanity and an alien power began, and across the galaxy. Every species with a sensor array watched in stunned silence as the Deathworlders of Earth finally showed the universe what they could do. The battle lasted 47 minutes, and it changed everything the galaxy believed about warfare. Warlord Thix had expected the humans to fight like the other species. He had conquered with caution and hesitation, and a desire to minimize casualties. He was wrong. The human ships charged directly into his formation, with a ferocity that his tactical officers could not comprehend. The first Shorn cruiser to open fire scored 3 direct hits on a human destroyer, and the bridge crew waited for the enemy ship to break apart. Instead, the destroyer kept coming with flames pouring from its hull, and it returned fire with weapons that punched through Shorn armor like it was made of paper. How is that ship still functioning? Commander Crash screamed as another volley tore into their defensive line. The humans build their ships with multiple redundant systems. The tactical officer reported with horror in his voice. They expect to take damage, and they design their vessels to keep fighting anyway. This was the fundamental difference between humanity and every other spacefaring species. The galaxy built ships to avoid damage. Humans built ships to survive it. The UES Perseverance moved through the Shorn formation like a predator, through a herd of prey, and its weapons carved destruction wherever they pointed. Admiral Chun stood on her bridge completely calm as explosions rocked the ship around her. "Damage report," she said. "Decks 7 through 9 have hull breaches, and we have fires on Deck 12 and medical reports 43 wounded. Keep firing," she ordered, and launched the boarding parties. Across the battlefield, human assault shuttles detached from their carrier ships and streaked toward the damaged Shorn vessels. Lieutenant Maya Kowalski gripped her rifle tight as her shuttle approached a Shorn destroyer that had lost its engines. She was 28 years old, and this was her first real combat mission, but she had trained for this her entire adult life. 30 seconds to breach. The pilot called out. Kowalski looked at her squad, and she saw no fear in their eyes, only determination. Beside her sat Sergeant Rodriguez with his massive frame barely fitting in the shuttle seat. Next to him was Private Chun, who was no relation to the Admiral, but who had the same steel in her spine, and at her feet lay Bruno, a German shepherd, who had been trained for ship-to-ship combat, and who was currently wagging his tail with excitement. Galaxy did not understand why humans brought animals into battle. They thought it was barbaric and primitive and foolish. They did not understand that humans and dogs had fought together for 15,000 years, and that the bond between them was stronger than any weapon. The shuttle slammed into the Shorn hull, and cutting lasers burned through the metal, and then the hatch blew open, and Kowalski led her squad into the enemy ship. The corridor was dark and filled with toxic smoke that would have killed an unprotected Velith in minutes. Kowalski and her squad wore sealed armor, but they could have survived without it for almost an horde. Deathworlders were built different. Movement ahead, Rodriguez reported as his motion tracker beeped with warnings. Shorn soldiers emerged from the smoke with their blade arms raised and their mouths open in war cries. They were larger than humans, and their bodies were covered in natural armor, and They had been bred for combat since before humans had invented fire. None of that mattered. Kowalski raised her rifle and fired 3 shots, and the first Shorn dropped with holes in his chest. Rodriguez moved up beside her, and his heavy weapon roared. And 2 more enemies fell. Bruno launched himself at a 4th soldier, and his jaws closed around the alien's throat, and the Shorn screamed as the dog dragged him to the ground. Private Chun covered their flank, and her grenades sent shrapnel through a group of reinforcements who had tried to approach from behind. The Shorn soldiers had expected the humans to die easily. Instead, they found themselves facing creatures who had evolved to hunt and kill and survive against impossible odds. One Shorn warrior managed to slash Kowalski across her left arm, and the blade cut deep into her flesh. She grunted with pain, and then she shot him in the face with her sidearm. "Lieutenant, you are injured," Rodriguez said with concern. "I noticed," she replied as she wrapped a quick bandage around her arm with one hand while keeping her rifle aimed down the corridor with the other. This was another thing that terrified the galaxy about humans. They could function through pain that would incapacitate any other species. They could keep fighting with injuries that should have killed them. They simply refused to stop. The squad pushed deeper into the Shorn destroyer, and they found the ship's command center, and they kicked down the door and secured the bridge in less than 2 minutes. The Shorn captain tried to trigger a self-destruct sequence, but Private Chun shot the console before he could complete the command. Ship secured. Kowalski reported over her radio. Enemy crew is surrendering. Similar reports came in from across the battlefield as human boarding parties captured ship after ship. Warlord Thix watched his fleet crumble, and he felt his pride shatter along with it. The Shorn had terrorized the galaxy for generations, and they had never lost a major engagement until today. "Warlord, we have lost 18 ships, and our remaining vessels are heavily damaged," Commander Crash reported with despair in his voice. Thix looked at the human fleet, and he saw that they had lost only 3 ships. While crippling his entire force, the mathematics were impossible, but the results were undeniable. "Order a full retreat," he said through gritted teeth. "Warlord, if we retreat, we will be disgraced, and the High Command will never forgive this defeat. If we stay, we will be destroyed," Thix replied, "and dead warriors cannot seek revenge." The surviving Shorn ships turned and fled into hyperspace, leaving behind a field of burning wreckage and captured vessels. On the damaged Velith diplomatic ship, Ambassador Cathrall heard the boarding parties cutting through the hull, and she prepared herself for death. But the soldiers who came through the breach wore different armor than the Shorn. "They were humans, Ambassador Cathrall?" the lead soldier asked in accented but understandable galactic standard. "Yes," she replied with shock in her voice. The buffet human smiled, and the expression was warm and genuine despite the blood on his armor. "My name is Captain Marcus Webb of the United Earth Marine Corps, and we are here to take you home." Cathrall watched as human medics rushed in to treat her wounded crew, and she saw one of them casually set his own broken arm before bending down to examine an injured Velith engineer. She had spent her entire career studying alien species, but she had never encountered anything like this. The humans were everything the galaxy had feared, and everything the galaxy had never dared to hope for. The footage spread across the galaxy within hours. Every news network on every inhabited world played the same recordings over and over until even the most isolated species knew what had happened in the Cathar system. The humans had come out of their quarantine, and they had crushed the Shorn collective like it was nothing on the Velith homeworld. Billions of citizens gathered around viewing screens and watched the battle unfold with a mixture of terror and wonder. The human ships moved like nothing anyone had ever seen, and their weapons were devastating, and their soldiers were relentless, but it was the aftermath that truly shocked the galaxy. The humans did not execute their prisoners. They did not claim the captured Shorn. Vessels as war prizes, they simply secured the area and began rescue operations, as if saving lives was the most natural thing in the universe. High Counselor Methor received a personal communication from Admiral Chun requesting a meeting, and the council chambers erupted into chaos. We cannot meet with them, Admiral Voshkin argued with fear playing in his voice. They have broken quarantine and violated dozens of treaties, and we have no idea what they want from us. They saved our ambassador, Counselor Drethan replied calmly. At minimum, we owe them the courtesy of a conversation. And what if that conversation ends with them demanding territory or resources or worse? Voshkin demanded. The humans just demonstrated that they can destroy any fleet in the galaxy, and you want to invite them into our capital. Methara listened to the debate, and she thought about what she had seen in the recordings she had watched. Admiral Chun gave the Shorn every opportunity to withdraw. Peacefully, she had seen human medics treating wounded aliens before, treating their own injured. She had observed the careful way the boarding parties had secured prisoners without unnecessary violence. These were not the actions of conquerors. We will meet with them, Methara announced, and her voice silenced the argument. They have earned that much. Admiral Chun arrived at the Veloth capital 3 days later, and she came alone, except for a small honor guard the council had expected her to bring a fleet as a show of force, but instead she arrived in a single diplomatic shuttle with no weapons visible. She walked into the council chambers, and she looked around with genuine curiosity at the architecture and the artwork and the assembled delegates from 6 different species. Thank you for receiving me, she said with a slight bow. I know this must be confusing for everyone. Confusing is an understatement, Counselor Tharic replied with an edge of suspicion in his voice. Your species has been in quarantine for 80 years, and now you suddenly appear with the most powerful fleet any of us have ever seen. Admiral Chun nodded, and her expression was thoughtful. I understand your concern, she said. You locked us away because you were afraid of what we might do, and now you are wondering if that fear was justified. Was it? Methara asked directly. The human admiral considered the question for a long moment before she answered. Probably, she admitted. Humans are dangerous, and we know that about ourselves, and we have a history of violence that would horrify most species in this room. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But we are also more than our worst impulses, Chun continued. We evolved on a world that should have killed us, and we survived by learning to work together and protect each other and care about creatures outside our own family groups. She gestured toward the viewing screen, where images from the rescue operation were still playing. We did not come to the Kethar system to conquer anyone, she said. We came because someone was in trouble, and we could help, and that is what neighbors do. Neighbors? Voshkin asked with disbelief. We quarantined your entire species, and now you call us neighbors? Admiral Chun laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine and completely unexpected. We were not offended by the quarantine, she explained. We understood why you did it, and frankly, we needed the time to develop anyway. And we used those 80 years to build and grow and prepare. Prepare for what? Methara asked. For this, Chun replied simply. For the moment when the galaxy would need us, and we could finally prove that we are more than the monsters you imagine. The council fell silent as they processed her words. Ambassador Kethrol, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward and addressed her fellow delegates. I was on that ship, she said. I watched the Shorm cut through our hull, and I prepared myself to die, and then the humans came and they saved us without asking for anything in return. She turned to look at Admiral Chun with something like wonder in her eyes. One of their medics had a broken arm, and he said it himself before he treated my injuries, and when I asked him why he risked his life for strangers, he seemed confused by the question. What did he say? Drethan asked. He said that helping people who need help is just what humans do. Kethril replied. He said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Methara looked at the human admiral, and she tried to reconcile everything she knew about Deathworlders with the person standing before her. Reports described humans as apex predators from a world of constant danger, but they did not describe the kindness in Chun's eyes or the patience in her voice, or the genuine respect she showed to species who had feared and rejected her people for generations. What do you want from us? Methara asked. Finally, Admiral Chun smiled. We want to be part of the galactic community, she said. We want to trade and learn and share ideas and make friends with species we've only read about in our observation reports. That seems remarkably reasonable, Derek said with suspicion. We are a remarkably reasonable species when we are not being shot at, Chun replied with a hint of humor. And the Shoan? Voshkin asked. What happens when they return with a larger fleet? The warmth in Admiral Chun's eyes flickered, and something hotter took its place. Then we will be here to meet them, she said simply, and they will learn the same lesson they learned today, which is that the galaxy is no longer unprotected. The council looked at each other and a silent understanding passed between them. For 3,000 years, they had tried to build a civilization based on peace and cooperation, and had made them vulnerable to predators like the Shornbud. Now they had a choice. They could continue to fear the humans and keep them locked away until the next threat came along, or they could accept the help being offered and face the future together. Methra stood, and she extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting that she had learned from the observation. Files, welcome to the Confederacy, Admiral Chun, she said. We have a lot to discuss. The human took her hand and shook it gently, and the galaxy changed forever. The Shorn Collective filed a formal protest with the Galactic Assembly within 1 week of the battle. Their representatives stood before the gathered delegates and demanded that humanity be condemned for violating quarantine protocols and interfering in sovereign military operations. The humans had no right to intervene, the Shorn ambassador declared with righteous anger. They were restricted to their home system by legal decree, and their actions constitute an act of war against the collective. The assembly chamber was silent as the delegates considered the argument. Technically, the Shorn were correct. The quarantine had been established by majority vote, and humanity had broken it without permission. But then Ambassador Kethril stood, and she walked to the center of the chamber, and she addressed the assembly with a strength that surprised even herself. The Shorn Collective attacked my vessel in neutral space, she said. They destroyed our engines and killed 17 members of my crew, and they intended to execute the survivors as a message to intimidate the Confederacy. She turned to face the Shorn ambassador directly. The humans broke quarantine to save our lives, she continued, and now you demand that we punish them for that act of compassion, and I find your argument disgusting. The assembly erupted into noise as delegates shouted their agreement or objection. Hi. Councilor Mathera called for order, and the chamber slowly quieted. We will vote on the matter, she announced. All those in favor of condemning humanity for quarantine violation, please indicate. 3 delegations raised their signals. Shorn and 2 of their client species. All those opposed, every other delegation in the chamber raised their signals. The vote was not even close. The motion fails, Mathara said with barely hidden satisfaction. And I would like to propose a counter-motion. She activated the central display and a new document appeared for all delegates to see. I propose that the quarantine of Earth be lifted immediately, and that humanity be invited to join the Galactic Assembly as a full member with all associated rights and responsibilities. The Shorn ambassador made a sound of outrage and stormed out of the chamber, followed by his allies. Nobody tried to stop them. The vote passed unanimously, Admiral Chun received the news on the bridge of the Perseverance, and she allowed herself a moment of quiet. Celebration 80 years of waiting had finally come to an end. Humanity was part of the galaxy now, but she knew that acceptance was only the first step, and that the real challenges lay ahead. She requested a private meeting with the full Velith High Council, and when they gathered, she spoke to them with complete honesty. "We are grateful for your welcome," she said, "but I want to be clear about something." The council listened with careful attention. "Humanity will join your community, and we will trade with you and learn from you and share our knowledge freely," Chun continued. "But we will also protect you." "Protect us from what?" Loshkin asked with a hint of his old suspicion. "From anyone who would prey on the weak," Chun replied. "The Shorn are not the only predators in this galaxy, and there are others who will see the Confederacy as easy targets, and we will not allow that." "You are offering to be our guardians?" Drethan asked thoughtfully. "We are offering to be your friends," Chun corrected. "And friends protect each other." Methora considered the implications of this offer. The Confederacy had always maintained a policy of strict neutrality, and they had avoided military alliances that might drag them into conflicts, but that policy had also left them vulnerable to species like the Shorn, who had no respect for peaceful intentions. "What do you ask in return?" she asked. "Nothing," Chun said simply. "We do not want territory or resources or political power, and we want only to be part of something larger than ourselves." "That seems too generous," Counselor Theric observed. "Every species wants something." Admiral Chun smiled, and her expression was almost sad. "We spent 80 years alone," she said, "watching the stars and wondering what was out there, and building ships that had nowhere to go, and training soldiers who had no one to protect." She looked around at the alien faces surrounding her. "Do you know how lonely that was?" she asked quietly. "We evolved to form bonds with other creatures and to care about things beyond our own survival, and you took that away from us when you established the quarantine." The council members shifted uncomfortably as they realized the truth in her words. "All we want is to matter to someone," Chun continued, "to have friends and allies and a purpose beyond simply existing. And if protecting the galaxy gives us that purpose, then we will do it gladly." Methora felt something shift in her understanding of humanity. She had seen the recordings of the battle, and she had witnessed the devastating power of human weapons and soldiers. But she had not understood the loneliness that drove them. Galaxy had feared humanity because they were dangerous, but the galaxy had also hurt humanity by rejecting them. "We accept your protection," Methora said, "and we offer our friendship in return." Far away on a Shorn military station, Warlord Thix received intelligence reports about Earth and its inhabitants. He studied the data with obsessive intensity, looking for weaknesses that might be exploited. What he found instead was Terror Earth. It was a world of constant destruction, where the ground shook and the sky burned and the water rose to swallow entire cities. The humans had evolved in this environment, and they had not just survived, but thrived. They had domesticated predators and harnessed the power of their hostile world and turned every disadvantage into strength, and they had spent the last 80 years preparing for war. The intelligence reports estimated that humanity had constructed over 300 capital ships and thousands of support vessels. They had developed weapons that could crack planets and shields that could withstand nuclear strikes. They had trained millions of soldiers who could function in conditions that would kill any other species in Minutest. Thix read report after report, and his fear grew with each new piece of information, but one detail terrified him more than any other. The humans had not built their armada because they wanted to conquer the galaxy. They had built it because they were bored. The quarantine had given them nothing to do except develop and grow and create. And they had filled that time by building the most powerful military force the galaxy had ever seen, simply because they could fix, close the intelligence file, and he sat in silence for a long time and spent his entire life believing that the Shorn were the greatest warriors in the galaxy and that no species could stand against them. He had been wrong. The humans were not trapped in quarantine with the galaxy. The galaxy had been trapped in quarantine with them, and now the door was open on Earth. 8 billion people looked up at the stars for the first time as members of the galactic community. Children asked their parents what it would be like to meet alien species, and parents told them stories about the Velith and the Confederacy and all the wonders that awaited them. Scientists prepared research proposals, and diplomats planned cultural exchanges, and merchants calculated trade routes that would make everyone rich. But the soldiers of the Third Solar Fleet knew better. They knew that the Shorn would return, and that other threats would emerge, and that humanity would be called upon again and again to protect those who could not protect themselves, and they welcomed it because that was what humans did. They found things to care about, and then they protected those things with everything they had. The galaxy had spent 80 years being afraid of humanity. Now they would learn to be grateful. Admiral Chun stood on the observation deck of the Perseverance, and she watched the stars stretch out before her in infinite wonder. The loneliness was finally over, and a new era had begun.